On the evening of July the 1st, in the year 1944, precisely at 5:40 in the twilight hours, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt reached out and grasped the telephone situated within the confines of his command headquarters. This facility stood at Saint-Germain, a grand, stately chateau located just to the west of Paris, a structure that had once been the residence of French royalty, evoking a sense of historical grandeur and aristocratic splendor. As he listened, the waning daylight seeped through the tall, elegant windows and cast a gentle glow across the room. Illuminating maps sprawled across the table in a disorganized fashion, their surfaces densely covered with markings, some painted in striking red, others in blue, that depicted the positioning, movements, and dispositions of military forces arrayed across the expansive territory of Normandy. On the other end of this vital communication line was Field Marshal Wilhelm Kittel, the esteemed chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, better known by his initials, OKW. The call originated from the Wolf's Lair, a heavily fortified headquarters hidden deep within the dense forests of East Prussia, over 1,000 miles away from the scene of the unfolding crisis. This place served as Adolf Hitler's clandestine and heavily guarded command center, a bunker complex designed to withstand any assault and from which he directed the war effort. Kittel's voice, layered with the crispness of a man under mounting pressure, bore the unmistakable nervous tension of someone who is tasked with relaying critical, potentially disastrous information to a leader whose grip on reality was increasingly fragile and disconnected from the deteriorating military situation. The German military situation in Normandy had been deteriorating rapidly for nearly a month and a half, without pause. As of that evening, 25 days had elapsed since the initial Allied landings on June the 6th, D-Day, an operation that had turned the tide of history in Western Europe. The American forces, determined and relentless, had just taken the port of Cherbourg, a strategic harbor of exceptional importance. This captured deep-water port meant that supplies, enormous quantities of weapons, food, ammunition, and equipment, could now be transported into France at an industrial rate, fueling the Allied advance and further crippling the German defenses. Simultaneously, the British forces were inching forward, steadily pressing toward the city of Carnat, a critical hub that controlled key road networks into France's interior regions. The progress was painstaking, yet relentless, illustrating a clear pattern of encroachment that threatened to overwhelm the German line of defense. Meanwhile, the toll of German casualties was staggering beyond measure. Soldiers were being killed, wounded, taken prisoner, or simply going missing in action across the front. These losses had accumulated to such a degree that entire divisions, large military units precisely composed of thousands of men, had been effectively dismantled, ceasing to exist as coherent fighting bodies. Replacements, new soldiers, and fresh units simply failed to arrive in sufficient numbers to compensate for the devastating losses inflicted by the relentless Allied assault. The Luftwaffe, Germany's aerial combat force, was no longer a capable adversary in the skies. Its strength had waned to the point where it could not effectively contest or defend the vital airspace over Normandy. The front lines, eroded and battered by constant Allied pressure, were now crumbling inch by inch, the retreat unstoppable and almost inevitable as each day passed. Kittel, burdened with the weight of the deteriorating situation, posed a question that had been echoing in the minds of many within the German command for weeks. It was a question that defined the desperate state of affairs. What should be done? What is our course of action? This inquiry was layered with frustration, uncertainty, and a sense of impending doom. The question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken, yet pregnant with implications of sacrifice or surrender. Von Rundstedt hesitated for a moment before responding. The line crackled softly, static crackling through the connection like the distant rumble of thunder. He was a man aged 68. By then, the senior-most field marshal in the entire German army, an experienced and seasoned soldier who had dedicated over half a century of his life to military service. His career spanned multiple German governments. He had served under the Imperial German regime, the Weimar Republic, and now the Nazi Third Reich. Throughout his long and distinguished military career, he had commanded the conquest of Poland in just 35 days, a remarkable feat of rapid military movement and strategic coordination. He had led Army Group South through Ukraine during the campaign of 1941, covering an immense front of approximately 400 miles in merely 3 months, an astonishing display of operational mobility and logistical prowess. Since 1942, he had overseen and directed the defensive efforts across Western Europe under the overall command structure, and had studied warfare with relentless attention throughout his adult life. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, the realities and the strategic imperatives of modern warfare. In that moment, knowing precisely what course of action was necessary, he understood the brutal truth that faced them all. Without hesitation, and with a tone that brooked no ambiguity, he issued a blunt and brutal assessment. "End the war, you fools," he declared. His words carried an air of bitter resignation, but also undeniable clarity. "What else can you do?" he added, his voice echoing the sense that all options had been exhausted, and that continued resistance was utterly futile in the face of Soviet overwhelm and Allied dominance. The connection went silent. No further words followed. Kittel said nothing in response, perhaps knowing that nothing remained to be said. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, filled with unspoken acknowledgement of the grim reality. Von Rundstedt had spoken the brutal truth that everyone within the high command was painfully aware of but dared not vocalize openly. The war, in its brutalness, was effectively lost, a fact that the leadership could not ignore any longer. Continued fighting would only prolong the inevitable, ensuring that Germany's destruction would be more thorough, more complete, and more devastating before the eventual surrender. In the days that followed, von Rundstedt was relieved of his command, an official acknowledgement of the failure of his council. He was replaced by Field Marshal Gunther von Knobelsdorff, a capable officer in his own right. Unfortunately, this change of leadership did little to alter the course. Von Knobelsdorff proved no more capable of reversing the deteriorating situation than his predecessor. The war droned on for nearly another 10 months, until May of the following year, costing millions more lives, demolishing countless German cities, turning them into heaps of rubble and ash. The Red Army, relentless and unyielding, pressed forward with determined ferocity, fighting their way through the remnants of German defenses to reach the heart of the Reich itself, Berlin. They exacted a brutal revenge for the atrocities committed by Germany during the war, exacting a terrible toll on the capital city and its inhabitants. Throughout this tragic and tumultuous period, the man who had foreseen and acknowledged the inevitable, that war was unwinnable, watched from his retirement, steadfast in his knowledge of the truth. The prophecy he had spoken plainly, the bitter diagnosis he had delivered, was fulfilled precisely as he had predicted, even though his honesty had led to dismissal and disdain from the very leadership that desperately clung to hope and fighting spirit. His eyes observed the unfolding catastrophe with quiet acuity, fully aware that the course of history had taken its inexorable path, one he had once known and understood fully. The sequence of events that unfolded during the critical span of 25 days, stretching from the pivotal moment of D-Day to that fateful telephone call, uncovers a deep and often uncomfortable truth about how military institutions can falter and fail when honesty is met with punishment rather than acknowledgement. It vividly illustrates the profound consequences that arise when those in command refuse to listen to the voices that are closest to the realities of the battlefield, especially those whose insights come from direct experience and intimate knowledge of the situation on the ground. Furthermore, these events reveal a universal truth that extends well beyond the domain of warfare. Often, the individuals who are most intimately aware of a problem or an obstacle are the very people who are ignored or silenced because they lack the power or the influence to compel attention. In many hierarchical organizations and institutions, those who are farthest removed from the immediate conflict or challenge tend to hold the most authority to dismiss or overlook the warnings offered by the frontline personnel, largely because they have the most to gain from maintaining the status quo and the least to lose if the truth surfaces. This imbalance between knowledge and power is a recurring theme that underscores why honest assessment is sometimes intolerable to those in high places. Because facing reality might require difficult decisions, acknowledgement of errors, or significant changes that threaten established interests or authority. In order to fully grasp the significance of von Rundstedt's statement and the high price he paid for voicing what he believed to be the truth, it is essential to understand the context of his observations, what he had been witnessing and analyzing since the spring of 1944, and what kind of man he was, both professionally and personally. Gerd von Rundstedt was born on the 12th of December in the year of our Lord 1875 in a small, quiet town called Ashes, Lebanon, nestled in the region of Prussian Saxony. His family line had a long-standing tradition of military service spanning generations, with ancestors who had served as officers and soldiers for the Prussian state and later the unified German Empire. For the von Rundstedt family, entering military service was never merely a career choice. It was a deeply ingrained familial obligation, a matter of aristocratic duty that defined their identity. It was part of their very heritage, a link to a proud history of service and discipline. Gerd's father, a respected officer, had served as a landholder of considerable influence before rising to the rank of general, embodying the military virtues that the family esteemed. His grandfather, meanwhile, had participated in the Napoleonic Wars, fighting for Prussia against the formidable French forces, a testament to the long-standing martial tradition that shaped the family's identity and values. From a very young age, it was understood within the family that Gerd would follow the same noble and disciplined path, that he would become an officer, just as his ancestors had before him. The expectation was as natural and unquestioned as learning to read or write. At the tender age of 16, in March of 1892, he joined the German army as a cadet, setting out on a path paved with honor, duty, and the rigorous discipline characteristic of the Prussian military aristocracy. Over the years, his career gradually ascended, and by the year 1914, when Europe was plunged into the chaos of the First World War, he had achieved the rank of captain and was serving on the staff of an army corps. The war itself proved a crucible for his abilities. Throughout the conflict, von Rundstedt spent his time working within the complex machinery of military staff positions, learning firsthand about the immense coordination required to move large armies across diverse terrains. He became skilled in the intricate arts of orchestrating artillery batteries in tandem with infantry divisions, managing supply lines that could make the difference between victory and starvation, and understanding the logistics that dictated whether armies could advance triumphantly or become bogged down by scarcity. Though he never became a hero on the front lines, his reputation grew for his methodical competence, clear-headed decision-making, and unwavering composure in moments of chaos and crisis. These qualities endeared him to his peers and superiors alike, earning him recognition as someone dependable and steady when circumstances spiraled out of control. After Germany's defeat in the year 1918, as the war ended and a new political order began to take shape, von Rundstedt elected to remain within the modest professional army that the Treaty of Versailles permitted Germany to sustain. Despite the upheavals and political turmoil, he continued to serve diligently, steadily rising through the ranks over the subsequent years. By 1932, he was entrusted with command of a cavalry division, a position indicating trust and respect from his peers. Just 4 years later, in 1936, he had become one of the senior-most generals within the German military establishment. This was a time of profound change, as Adolf Hitler's rise to power in the year 1933 was transforming the political landscape of Germany. Yet, von Rundstedt was already an established figure, embodying the old Prussian military aristocracy, an embodiment of a tradition that predated the Nazi movement by several centuries. Importantly, von Rundstedt was not a supporter of the Nazi ideology. He was not a member of the Nazi Party, nor did he openly espouse its doctrine. Throughout his career, he maintained a professional distance from the political movements that swept through Germany. He viewed Hitler with a mixture of cautious detachment and aristocratic disdain. He considered the Führer a bohemian soldier, reminding himself of Hitler's modest rank as a corporal during the First World War and his Austrian origins that set him apart from the traditional Prussian officer class. Von Rundstedt regarded himself as a true soldier of Germany, loyal first and foremost to the nation, to the army, and to the centuries-old traditions of Prussian military discipline and honor. His allegiance was to the state and its institutions, not to any political faction or movement. Over the years, he understood that politicians might come and go, but that the military and its traditions endured beyond individual regimes. Nonetheless, he also recognized that he belonged to a certain class and era, which meant that he was willing to serve whoever was in control of the German government, regardless of whether they upheld noble ideals or pursued questionable, even destructive, goals. Such was his complex identity, a devoted soldier, bound to his nation and its military legacy, yet adaptable enough to serve the prevailing powers of his time, even when they diverged from his personal principles. When Adolf Hitler embarked upon initiating the Second World War, a conflict that would eventually engulf the entire globe, a man named Gerd von Rundstedt found himself drawn into the chaos of combat, fully committed to the cause of the German military effort. Throughout the tumultuous years that followed, he fought on his nation's behalf without ever questioning the morality or justice of the war itself. In those early days, when the Wehrmacht was marching forward with relentless determination, von Rundstedt did not choose to resign in protest or express doubt about the conflict's righteousness. Instead, he threw himself into his duties with unwavering dedication, focusing solely on executing his orders with exceptional skill and precision. His role in the invasion of Poland during September of the year 1939 demonstrated his remarkable ability to conduct complex military operations seamlessly. His leadership during that campaign was nothing short of a masterwork, a brilliantly orchestrated display of combined arms tactics where infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support worked in perfect harmony to achieve strategic objectives. At the helm of the German forces was von Rundstedt, commanding the formidable Army Group South, a force that advanced rapidly from Silesia towards the Polish capital of Warsaw. In his capable hands, the offensive moved with astonishing speed and accuracy, covering an average of 100 meters every single day. Over the course of just 2 weeks, his army managed to encircle and isolate the Polish military units, effectively preventing them from forming any cohesive or sustainable defensive lines. The swift, relentless pressure applied by his forces culminated in the collapse of Polish resistance after a mere 35 days, a campaign so swift and decisive that Poland ceased to exist as an independent nation-state, absorbed into the expanding German Empire. The momentum of von Rundstedt's military prowess did not falter as the year 1940 arrived. In May of that year, he led the invasion of France as part of the grand German strategy to dominate Western Europe. His command, known as Army Group A, played a pivotal role in this campaign, especially through the daring assault across the Ardennes, a dense, forested highland region in Belgium and Luxembourg that many French planners had dismissed as impractical terrain for armored warfare. Despite these doubts, von Rundstedt's 7 armored panzer divisions pushed meticulously through narrow, winding roads, breaking through the obstacles that others considered insurmountable. These divisions emerged decisively behind the main defensive line established by the French, effectively exploiting a critical gap in the enemy's defenses. Within just 6 weeks of relentless fighting, the French government surrendered unconditionally, marking a victory of such magnitude that it stood as the greatest German military triumph since the unification campaigns of the 19th century. Following his successes in Western Europe, von Rundstedt was entrusted with an even more formidable task in June of 1941, leading the German invasion of the Soviet Union. As the commander of Army Group South, he spearheaded the Eastern Campaign, pushing relentlessly through Ukraine. Covering an astonishing 400 miles over a period of 3 months, his forces encircled and captured Kyiv, executing one of the largest and most complex encirclements in military history. In this operation alone, more than 500,000 Soviet soldiers either perished or fell into German custody, a staggering toll that underscored the ferocity and scale of the conflict. Von Rundstedt's reputation as one of Germany's most gifted and capable military commanders was firmly established through these remarkable achievements. However, amid these victories, von Rundstedt could not ignore an unsettling reality that many in Berlin refused to acknowledge. Despite devastating losses, the Soviet Union did not appear to be collapsing under the weight of the invasion. The Red Army, severely battered, was far from surrendering or disintegrating. New divisions would swiftly be formed to replace those destroyed, and Soviet industry, despite widespread evacuations beyond the Ural Mountains, continued tirelessly to produce tanks, aircraft, and other war material. The brutal winter of 1941 brought the German advance to a grinding halt just outside Moscow, dashing Hitler's hopes of an immediate, sweeping victory. The rapid victory promised by the Führer was slipping further out of reach with each passing day. By December of that year, von Rundstedt was faced with an agonizing decision when the German lines at Rostov, a strategic city in southern Russia, became indefensible. His forces could no longer hold their positions and had to begin withdrawing. Hitler's fury was immediate and intense. He had explicitly forbidden any retreats, viewing them as signs of weakness or failure. In contrast, von Rundstedt, realizing that holding the city was no longer feasible, offered his resignation, which Hitler accepted politely but coldly. For the first time, the seasoned field marshal discovered the harsh truth of what awaited commanders who dared to voice dissent or deliver unwelcome news to the Führer. It was a sobering lesson, etched into his memory, that in the Nazi hierarchy, loyalty to Hitler's will was paramount, regardless of the strategic realities. Yet, despite this setback, Germany still relied heavily on von Rundstedt's expertise. In March of the year 1942, Hitler summoned von Rundstedt back to active service, appointing him as the commander-in-chief of all German forces in Western Europe. His new mission was daunting in scope, preparing and organizing the formidable defense of the Atlantic coast, stretching from the neutral waters of Norway all the way down to Spain. Nearly 3,000 miles of coastline vulnerable to an impending Allied invasion. Everyone involved in military circles understood that the Allies would invade Western Europe eventually. The critical questions centered on where, when, and whether Germany could withstand and repulse the assault. Von Rundstedt's command included dozens of divisions on paper, but the reality was far less ideal. Many of these units were understrength, lacking sufficient trained soldiers, or composed of men who, due to age or injury, should not have been on the front lines. Some divisions consisted chiefly of older men, conscripted into service after their younger compatriots had been killed or captured in the earlier campaigns eastward. A grim reflection of the toll the war was taking on the German military machine. In various military formations and strategic commands across the German forces, there existed divisions composed of soldiers who had come from the territories of the Soviet Union that Germany had conquered during the course of the war. Many of these troops had either volunteered out of a sense of nationalistic fervor or had been coerced through force and intimidation into serving the German war effort. However, the reliability of these units was often in question, as they were frequently poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and sometimes lacked the steadfast discipline that German forces traditionally upheld. Their weaponry and equipment, in many cases, were outdated or replaced with obsolete models that could no longer match the technological advancements made by the Allies. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had suffered significant losses and no longer held control of the skies over Western Europe. The once vast and powerful Air Force had been diminished to a force struggling to maintain any semblance of air mastery. As a consequence, Allied bombers launched relentless strikes against key German industrial centers during both daytime and nighttime, targeting factories, transportation hubs, and military installations to cripple the German war economy and military production capabilities. The fighter units assigned to challenge these American and British bombers found themselves engaged in a grueling battle of attrition. These fighters were being worn down, their numbers dwindling, and their effectiveness diminishing making it impossible for them to stem the relentless tide of Allied air assault. Simultaneously, the maritime situation had become increasingly dire for Germany. The Kriegsmarine, or German Navy, had lost the crucial Battle of the Atlantic, a conflict that determined the fate of supplies and reinforcements arriving from the United States and other Allied nations. Although some U-boat submarines still navigated the waters, their numbers were insufficient, and their vessels were being sunk at a far greater rate than they could be constructed or replenished. The Atlantic convoy routes, which transported essential American troops, weapons, and supplies across the vast ocean to Britain, remained open and unobstructed, allowing the Allies to sustain their military campaign with unimpeded flow. This precarious situation led to a grim reality for German military leadership, especially for General von Rundstedt, who was tasked with defending the entire continent of Western Europe against the inevitable Allied invasion. He was confronted with the harsh truth that he was expected to hold a massive landmass with an army already severely weakened and bleeding resources in the east, fighting against enemies who held dominance over both the sea and the sky. A situation made worse by the complete lack of reinforcements and the absence of any significant margin for error. Von Rundstedt understood the harsh mathematics of this predicament all too well. Every month saw Germany's strategic position grow more fragile and less tenable, as the relentless march of Allied power and resources continues unabated. Yet, as a professional soldier, he felt compelled by duty to do his best under the circumstances. His responsibility was to prepare the most effective defensive strategy possible, knowing full well that the outcome depended on many unpredictable factors. He clung to the hope that somehow the tide of the war might shift in Germany's favor someday, giving them an opportunity to stabilize or even reverse their fortunes. But at the core of his concern lay the fundamental and unchangeable issue: resources. Germany simply did not possess enough manpower, an adequate number of trained soldiers, to defend every stretch of coastline. The tanks they had available were insufficient in quantity or outdated in model compared to the formidable Allied armored units. Their aircraft fleets were too small to cover the vast airspace. Moreover, fuel reserves were critically low, further constraining operational capacity. The Atlantic coast alone stretched over thousands of miles, leaving plenty of vulnerable points where an enemy could strike. The Allies, with their extensive amphibious and airborne forces, could potentially land almost anywhere along this immense stretch of coastline. Faced with this daunting reality, German military leaders had to make difficult decisions about where to allocate their limited forces. They needed to determine which areas were most likely to be targeted by the Allies and where to focus their defenses. Prioritization became essential. Some sectors would be reinforced heavily, while others would be left weaker or temporarily unprotected. To do this effectively, German commanders had to concentrate their available forces on the most probable invasion sites, accepting a certain level of risk in less defended areas and hoping that their strategic choices would be sufficient to slow or halt the advancing Allied forces. This dilemma marked the beginning of a fierce internal conflict among German military commanders. On one side, von Rundstedt was inclined to keep his panzer divisions in reserve, positioned strategically inland, perhaps around 100 miles from the coastline, so they could be mobilized rapidly if an invasion was detected. His reasoning was rooted in classical military doctrine, which emphasizes that one cannot be strong everywhere simultaneously. Instead, commanders wait until they see where the enemy commits his strength, then gather their own forces at that critical point to launch a knockout counterattack. Von Rundstedt believed that holding back his armored units would give him a powerful hammer to strike once the invasion's primary landing site was clearly identified. His plan was to keep these reserves uncommitted until the precise location of the Allied landings was confirmed, after which the armored divisions would surge forward to crush the beachhead and prevent it from securing a strong foothold. Concentrating all armor along the entire coastline would, in his view, render the German forces too weak across the board to be capable of delivering a decisive blow in any particular sector. Instead, he sought to hold back his mobile units, ready to strike decisively when the moment was right, employing a classic form of strategic depth and flexibility. However, not everyone agreed with von Rundstedt's approach. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who in November of the year 1943 had been appointed to command Army Group B under the authority of von Et, held a completely different view. Rommel, a seasoned and battle-hardened officer, had fought in North Africa against the British and American forces. He was well acquainted with what Allied air power could accomplish in modern warfare, and he understood the devastating effects it could have on land forces. In the deserts of North Africa, he had witnessed firsthand how well-coordinated airstrikes could destroy supply convoys on the dusty roads leading to Tripoli. He had seen tanks destroyed by fighter bombers before they even reached the front lines, rendering the armored columns useless and vulnerable. Moreover, Rommel had experienced the destructive power of naval gunfire against coastal positions, having watched ships bombard beachheads with deadly accuracy. His military experience had taught him that once the Allies established themselves on the shore, German armor would find it nearly impossible to reach the beaches in time to launch effective counterattacks. The continuous presence of Allied fighter bombers overhead would systematically destroy any armored vehicles trying to move along the roads or assemble for counteroffensive operations. Naval guns would hammer coastal defenses and any approaching reinforcements attempting to land. He believed that the only viable strategy to prevent the Allied invasion from succeeding was to defeat it immediately at its initial stage, within the first hours of landing, before the enemy could consolidate their beachhead and expand their foothold. Rommel's doctrine centered around a rapid, aggressive defense designed to strike the invaders early and decisively, employing all available resources to crush the invasion before it could take hold and become unmanageable. To him, spreading forces along the entire coastline was a futile effort. Instead, concentrated, well-prepared, and immediate action was the only path to prevent the Allies from establishing a secure and lasting foothold in Western Europe. On that pivotal day, every military asset, from the smallest tank to the most powerful artillery piece, had to be positioned as close to the shoreline as possible, because in this operation, proximity to the waterline was not just strategic but essential for success. The entire invasion hinged on preventing the enemy from crossing the water barrier. If they succeeded in establishing a foothold beyond the coast, all efforts would likely be futile. It was a race against time, a contest to stop the advancing forces at the very edge of the sea, because if the fighting spilled inland without restraint, the invasion could not be halted at all. General RML, a seasoned military strategist, famously told his staff that the outcome of the first 24 hours would be decisive, not only for the Allies, but also for the German forces defending Normandy. He believed this initial day would determine the entire course of the battle, calling it, with a certain foreboding, the longest day. Both he and his opponent, von Rundstedt, held valid points rooted in decades of military experience. Von Rundstedt favored a conventional, classical approach, relying on established tactics and the predictable patterns of warfare learned through history, which had often proved effective in past conflicts. Meanwhile, RML had a keen sense of the enemy's formidable aerial and naval capabilities, an understanding grounded in detailed intelligence and careful analysis of Allied strength in the air and at sea. Although a strategic compromise could have combined the strengths of both methods, perhaps blending methodical, well-planned defenses with aggressive, dynamic responses, Adolf Hitler, in a characteristic display of decision-making, chose a line of action that turned out to be extremely unfavorable. Rather than endorsing a flexible, decentralized strategy, he maintained authoritative control over critical divisions by personally directing their movements. This meant that the elite panzer divisions, including the Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS Panzer Division, could not advance or respond to developments without Hitler's explicit consent. Such a decision severely diminished the strategic agility of the German command structure because it removed the necessary latitude for field commanders to adapt swiftly to the unfolding battle. In practice, this meant that as the invasion commenced and chaos erupted on the beaches, Those officers who observed enemy progress and recognized opportunity for counterattack or reinforcement were forced to seek approval from Hitler, who was thousands of miles away in his bunker, incapable of direct observation or immediate command. This absurd bottleneck created inevitable delays, hours in a battle where time was measured in precious moments, and led to confusion and inefficiency. The critical hours immediately following the landings, instead of being exploited to push back the invaders or stabilize the beaches, often went to waste, waiting for orders that might arrive too late or not at all. On the dawn of June 6th, in the year of 1944, D-Day, the Allies launched their assault along 5 carefully chosen beaches extending across a stretch of approximately 50 miles of the Normandy coast. The initial landings on Utah Beach saw the American 4th Infantry Division make their descent with relatively light casualties, thanks to favorable conditions and limited resistance. Conversely, at Omaha Beach, the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions encountered the formidable defenses of the German 352nd Infantry Division. The fighting there proved extremely fierce, resulting in extraordinarily high casualties. More than 2,000 soldiers killed or wounded within the first few hours of the assault. On the remaining beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the British and Canadian forces faced stubborn but ultimately less resilient resistance. Despite the challenges, they managed to establish footholds, setting the stage for a broader offensive. That first day, approximately 156,000 men managed to come ashore across these 5 beaches. Accompanying their landing were nearly 11,000 aircraft that maintained complete mastery over the skies over the invasion area, providing crucial air support and aerial reconnaissance. Supporting this massive operation was an unparalleled naval armada. Over 7,000 ships ferrying troops, equipment, and supplies, representing the largest maritime convoy ever assembled in human history. To reinforce the initial landings, more than 23,000 airborne troops, including over 13,000 American paratroopers, were dropped behind enemy lines during the night preceding D-Day. These forces seized vital bridges and key road junctions, planting chaos deep within the German rear areas and disrupting their logistical capabilities. Their efforts created confusion and disruptions that contributed significantly to the overall success of the invasion. Von Rundstedt, the Germans' top military planner, learned about the landings around 6:30 in the morning through reports from coastal defense units and early reconnaissance. It was clear almost immediately that this was no mere raid or reconnaissance mission. This was a full-scale invasion, a meticulously coordinated assault aimed at breaking through the defenses along the coast. Paratroopers had been landing continuously for hours, and naval bombardments had raged since before dawn, pounding the German positions. The scale and intensity of the attack left no doubt. The Allies intended to carve a decisive breach into the German Atlantic Wall. In response to the unfolding chaos, von Rundstedt urgently requested the immediate deployment of the Panzer Reserves, specifically the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzerlehr Division, so they could counterattack and contain the breach if authorized to mobilize. These elite divisions stood ready, poised to strike back against the invading forces, but only if Hitler approved their movement. Every hour that passed without authorization allowed the Allied beachhead to grow deeper and more secure. Each delay was a significant setback, granting the Allies precious time to consolidate their gains and bring in reinforcements. Hitler was at his headquarters, an imposing fortress known as the Burghof in Bavaria, where he had been staying since late spring. During the night of June 5th to June 6th, he had remained awake until the early hours, engrossed in watching newsreels about the ongoing events, accompanied by his close associates, such as General Goebbels and Eva Braun. Despite the mounting urgency and the obvious scale of the invasion, he hesitated to release the Panzer Reserves, believing that the existing German defenses could still hold, or perhaps trusting in the allocation of forces already in place. The decision-making process, hampered by his direct control and reluctance to act swiftly, came under critical tension as the world watched the unfolding drama on the coast of Normandy. a battle that would greatly influence the course of history in the decades to come. His personal physician had prescribed him a sleeping pill in an effort to help him combat the persistent and agonizing insomnia that had plagued him for many months. The medication was intended to induce rest, yet it did little to assure the repose he desperately needed. Meanwhile, his staff, who lived in daily terror of his unpredictable and often furious outbursts, refused to risk waking him, fearing that any disturbance might provoke his wrath and further complicate their already difficult situation. The orders from the higher command were absolute and clear. Under no circumstances was he to be disturbed, even if it meant neglecting the most basic needs of his well-being. The burden of this decree was so great that even a senior figure such as Albert Schar, who served as the Minister for Armament and was well aware of the critical importance of timely decisions, arrived at the Berghoff residence around 10 o'clock in the morning and found him still lying deep in sleep, unresponsive to the outside world. The personnel responsible for the security and maintenance of the command stood motionless, their engines cold, and their crews waiting patiently for directions that, for the moment, did not arrive. Hours crept by slowly, unaltered and heavy with anticipation. During this time, the Allies solidified their footholds along the coast, extending their lines and bringing in reinforcements. More soldiers, more tanks, and additional equipment, day by day. The beachheads now connected and formed a continuous front, a persistent threat to the German defenses. As the hours passed, the opportunity for a decisive counterattack drew nearer to slipping away, yet Hitler remained in a state of uncertain hesitation. It was only around midday that he finally stirred from his slumber, but even then, doubt clouded his judgment. He clung to the conviction that the Normandy operation was merely a distraction, a feint designed to divert German forces from the true intended invasion site, which, he believed, was the narrowest channel across the English Channel at Paradala, only about 21 miles away from the British coast. The complex deception campaign, codenamed Fortitude, had succeeded so thoroughly that German intelligence was convinced that a formidable army group commanded by General George Patton was mobilized and poised in southeast England to strike at a target called Killala. In Hitler's mind, the entire Normandy invasion was nothing more than a trap, a grand deception intended to mislead and draw away crucial German reserves under the illusion of a threat that would never materialize. This misjudgment led Hitler to withhold crucial Panzer reserves. He refused to release them until he was absolutely certain of the true objective. Consequently, these forces remained in place, waiting in vain for an attack on Killala that never happened. The effectiveness of such deception was so profound that Hitler continued to believe in the existence of the Phantom Army for weeks after the initial landings, delaying the deployment of forces that could have played a decisive role in the Normandy campaign. It was only late in the afternoon, around 4 o'clock, that the Panzers finally received authorization to move forward, but by that point, the skies were filled with Allied aircraft that had been waiting for the signal. Columns of tanks and trucks trundled along the French roads in broad daylight, an easy prey for precision fighter bombers. Repeatedly, these aircraft struck, destroying vehicles, blocking vital routes, and unleashing chaos across the battlefield. What should have been a swift and coordinated deployment devolved into a grueling, arduous ordeal, hampered at every turn. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit near enough to launch a counterattack on D-Day, managed to initiate a disorganized assault that evening. One battalion, despite the chaos, even reached the coast between the designated British landing beaches. Yet it was too weak and too scattered to capitalize on this breach effectively. By the end of the day, it was forced to withdraw, having lost 70 of its 124 tanks in the process. The pivotal moment to push the Allies back into the sea had already slipped away and would never come again. As this bleak reality unfolded, General von Rundstedt observed the developments with a deepening sense of despair. Each passing hour meant more reinforcements for the invading forces. More men, more tanks, more artillery, landing on the beaches and spreading further inland. The longer the delay, the stronger the Allies' defenses became. Their supply lines grew more secure and their positions more entrenched. Every hour diminished Germany's slim chances of mounting a successful counteroffensive, and yet there was absolutely nothing that von Rundstedt could do to alter that course. The critical decisions were being made far away, in Bavaria, by a man who had never commanded troops in the chaos of battle, who refused to set foot on the front lines, and who relied entirely on colored pins and markers on a map to understand a situation that could only truly be comprehended by those who saw it firsthand. The first week after the Normandy landings confirmed von Rundstedt's darkest fears. The Allies were not retreating or being repelled. Instead, they were establishing firm footing, building up their forces steadily, and preparing to break out from the initial landing zones and push further into the heart of France. It was becoming increasingly clear that the momentum was decisively shifting in favor of the Western Allies, signaling a turning point in the conflict that Germany could no longer halt through mere defensive measures. The series of German counterattacks, which had been undertaken with relentless determination, repeatedly failed to achieve their intended objectives. The moment the 12th SS Panzer Division, which was among Germany's most well-equipped and formidable armored units, finally arrived at the battlefield, it launched a series of aggressive assaults that inflicted significant casualties on the advancing Allied forces. Despite these intense efforts and the fierce fighting put forth by the German troops, the division was unable to break through the established beachhead, which had been secured earlier during the invasion. This division, regarded as one of the most elite and heavily supplied armored formations within the German military, was repeatedly committed to the combat zones in piecemeal fashion, rather than in a unified, overwhelming force. As a result, it began to suffer losses in personnel and equipment that it would never be able to compensate for effectively, deeply weakening its operational capability. Meanwhile, the reinforcements that the Germans desperately needed to bolster their faltering position faced serious delays. These delays were primarily caused by the relentless Allied air assaults directed at critical transportation infrastructure across France, particularly targeting railways and bridges. For months prior to D-Day, the Allies had systematically and meticulously destroyed significant portions of the French rail network in a campaign designed to hinder the mobility of German reinforcements. This strategic campaign culminated in the situation faced during the invasion day, where divisions that should have arrived swiftly within days found themselves delayed by weeks due to the destruction of vital rail lines and logistical choke points. Adding to the chaos and confusion was the active and resourceful French resistance. These underground fighters, operating behind German lines, played a crucial role by sabotaging communication lines, cutting telephone wires that connected German units, ambushing transport convoys, and providing vital intelligence to the Allied command. Their efforts contributed significantly to the disorder on the German-held front, hampering the ability of the Wehrmacht to respond effectively to the evolving battlefield conditions. Although the front lines were gradually stabilizing, this stabilization was, in reality, tilting in favor of the Allied forces as the Germans faced mounting disadvantages. On the 18th of June, precisely 11 days after the initial landings, a pivotal meeting took place near the French town of Marival. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and General Rommel, key German military leaders, convened with Adolf Hitler in a well-fortified command bunker complex situated close to the French-Swiss border, known as Wolfluck II. This bunker, built in 1940, had originally been designed for the planned invasion of Britain, and remarkably, it would be the only time Hitler ever utilized this underground facility. It also marked the first time since 1940 that Hitler set foot on French soil following the armistice, which had ended the fighting in France in 1940. Despite countless prior requests from his commanders urging him to visit the front lines or smaller operational areas, Hitler had refused, preferring to stay at a distance from the chaos of the battlefield. Now, however, he arrived at the bunker far behind the front lines, surrounded by layers of security and guarded by numerous military personnel to ensure his safety. The journey had begun the previous day, with Hitler flying from his residence nestled within the gardens of Basha, then traveling by motorcade through the night to the bunker. When he finally arrived, he appeared visibly pale and exhausted, with his hands trembling noticeably, signs that drew the attention of those present. His usual energy and commanding presence had been replaced by a nervous restlessness. He moved with a pronounced stoop, and the investors who observed him became increasingly alarmed by the apparent mental and physical deterioration. In the subsequent discussion, Rommel was the first to speak, delivering an unvarnished account of the dire situation on the front. He laid out in stark terms that the defensive line was barely holding, with German casualties mounting to approximately 2,500 men every single day, while the rate of replacements lagged far behind, perhaps around only 1,000 new soldiers arriving weekly. It was clear that the Allied forces enjoyed complete mastery of the air, with their airplanes dominating the skies and preventing any effective German movement, resupply, or reinforcement during daylight hours without risking devastating attack from above. The relentless buildup of Allied forces on the Western Front was clear evidence that their strength was steadily increasing, while the Wehrmacht's resources and manpower were diminishing at an alarming rate. The undeniable mathematics of the situation pointed to a grim inevitability. Unless something changed dramatically and swiftly, the German front was destined to eventually collapse under the weight of the Allied onslaught. Rommel, aware of the gravity of these facts, also emphasized the political implications of the military crisis. He suggested that if victory in the West was no longer attainable through conventional military means, then perhaps it was time to explore diplomatic avenues, negotiations that might, at least, preserve some remnants of Germany's standing, influence, or bargaining power before total defeat rendered all negotiations impossible. This candid and sobering assessment provoked an immediate and furious response from Hitler. He erupted in anger, accusing Rommel of defeatism, of lacking faith in the German cause, and of failing to grasp the full scope of the situation. Hitler insisted that new, innovative weapons systems, which he believed were about to turn the tide of the war, would soon begin to change everything. He pointed to the recent deployment of the V-1 flying bombs, which had started hitting London, and predicted that the subsequent deployment of V-2 rockets would have an even greater destructive impact. Hitler also believed that jet aircraft would sweep Allied bombers from the sky, rendering the air superiority of the Allies irrelevant. He remained convinced that these so-called wonder weapons, along with advanced technology and secret projects, would radically alter the course of the conflict. Despite all evidence to the contrary, Hitler remained steadfast in his conviction that the German troops must fight with relentless determination, defending every inch of occupied territory at all costs. He demanded that his forces continue their fierce resistance, holding the line regardless of the mounting losses, and reminded his generals that the morale and territorial integrity of Germany depended on their unwavering commitment and tenacity. In the face of relentless adversity and under the most unwavering resolve, they refused to contemplate retreat or withdrawal from their positions. Every soldier and every unit was commanded to stand firm, holding each line with the resolve of a last man defending his homeland. The belief in ultimate victory was so potent that it transcended mere mathematics and tangible advantages. It was a conviction that faith and unwavering willpower could defy the cold calculations of probability and numerical odds. The command was clear: no retreat, no surrender. Any attempt to withdraw was considered a betrayal of their collective duty. Orders were given with absolute certainty. Every position had to be held at all costs, no matter the circumstances. Willpower, fueled by a near-religious confidence in their cause, was expected to triumph over material disadvantages, such as shortages of reinforcements or superior enemy forces. They believed that steadfastness and conviction could turn the tide of battle, even against overwhelming odds. The directive was unequivocal. Cherbourg's defenses had to be maintained no matter what, at the most extreme cost if necessary, as it was deemed a critical point in their strategic layout. The conference, which was meant to be a forum for planning and strategic decision-making, was suddenly disrupted in an abrupt manner when an unscheduled and destructive V-1 rocket detonated nearby, causing chaos and panic among the participants. The explosion and subsequent alarm forced everyone into hurried action, seeking immediate shelter from the falling shrapnel and the impact of the strike. This attack underscored the ever-present threat of unconventional weapons that haunted their efforts and complicated their logistics, injecting an element of unpredictability into every commanding meeting. During this tense gathering, von Rundstedt observed in silence, choosing not to voice arguments or dissent. He had come to recognize a stark truth, that debating and criticizing Hitler's decisions was futile. The Führer's stubbornness and unshakable confidence in his own judgment made any opposition a fruitless exercise. Hitler's responses to reason analysis were not grounded in logic or strategic clarity, but rather in his personal intuitions and deeply held beliefs. He acted based on an unshakable conviction that he understood the nature of warfare better than the seasoned professionals who had dedicated their entire lives to studying its complexities. This singular mindset meant that rational debate was often dismissed outright, replaced instead by reliance on instincts and dogma. In the subsequent days, von Rundstedt reflected and concluded that the meeting had achieved little. It was a forum for inconclusive chatter rather than decisive strategic affirmations. The leader, who once had a reputation for making bold, calculated gambles, decisions rooted in a clear-eyed understanding of enemy weaknesses, was now increasingly consumed by fantasies about miraculous weapons and unwavering tenacity. His faith in new and proven superweapons, coupled with a belief that their sheer force of will alone could turn the tide of a brutal conflict, signaled a shift towards desperation and delusion. The assembly ended with no substantive decisions or strategic shifts. The same unwavering orders persisted: hold every position, launch counterattacks when possible, and wait patiently for the deployment of what they believed would be game-changing weapons. Most importantly, they were to maintain their faith, despite evidence to the contrary. Meanwhile, Vonnet and Rammel returned to France exhausted and disillusioned, fully aware that they had failed to effect any meaningful change. They had presented facts and offered detailed analyses, laying out the stark realities of the battlefield with clarity, yet their warnings and recommendations had been ignored outright. Both men came to accept a harsh truth: that the war would drag on indefinitely until Germany's complete defeat became inevitable, because the unpredictable and stubborn leadership at the helm refused to accept any alternative outcome. The situation on the ground continued to worsen at an alarming pace over the following days. On the 18th of June, American forces executed a strategic maneuver that decisively cut off the Sinton Peninsula, effectively isolating the fortified city of Cherbourg, which contained critical port facilities essential for supplying their forces. Hitler issued an uncompromising order. The garrison was to hold their positions to the very last man, regardless of the mounting pressure from the advancing Allies. The defenders fought fiercely, displaying remarkable determination, yet their resolve could not withstand the relentless assault of American artillery batteries and infantry divisions. The city's defenses crumbled within the span of 2 days, on June 26th and 27th, after intense and desperate combat. Eventually, the commanding officer of the garrison surrendered, recognizing that further resistance would only lead to unnecessary destruction and loss of life. The harbor fortifications remained steadfast until June 29th, resisting American attacks for as long as possible before capitulating to overwhelming forces. Almost immediately after their surrender, American engineers set to work, rapidly repairing and establishing the port's vital infrastructure. Within a few months, the port was capable of handling upwards of 14,000 tons of supplies daily, an impressive feat that significantly boosted Allied logistical capabilities in the region. Conversely, on the other side of the front lines, the British forces were engaged in a relentless, grinding campaign toward Cachin, the strategic city that General Bernard Montgomery had hoped to capture on the very day of the initial D-Day landings. Despite 3 weeks of intense fighting following the initial assault, Cachin remained in German hands. It was a stubborn holdout that drained German armored and logistical reserves at an unsustainable pace. Operation Epsom, launched on June 26th, was a carefully planned offensive aimed at forcing the Germans to divert forces and provide an opening for a breakthrough. The British forces advanced with determination, pushing fiercely into the German defenses until they reached within about 2 miles of Khen, a significant proximity that represented a tangible threat. However, German defenders, fighting with desperate resilience, managed to halt the British advance, inflicting heavy losses in the process. The cost of this halted offensive was severe. The German armies, especially their armored divisions and experienced crews, bore the brunt of the combat. The division units that von Rundstedt had wanted to keep intact and mobile now found themselves increasingly trapped in static defensive positions, grinding away in prolonged attritional fights. Every single day saw dozens of tanks destroyed by naval gunfire, artillery shells, fighter-bomber strikes, and Allied armored assaults, steadily bleeding the German armored reserve. Trained crews, many of whom had spent years honing their skills, were killed or wounded in the relentless onslaught. The German Western Front was hemorrhaging manpower and material at a rapid rate, holding a line that was steadily unraveling and poised to collapse no matter how fiercely they fought. Yet, von Rundstedt understood the grim reality, that their forces were enduring a slow, painful death. Rommel, the other senior officer, shared this understanding. Both men recognized that the German army was gradually bleeding its strength and would eventually be forced to retreat or be overwhelmed. Despite their awareness, they continued to fight, knowing that each day of stalemate further drained the once powerful Wehrmacht, inching it closer to collapse. The officers commanding the German forces who were actively involved on the battlefield had a clear and firm understanding of the dire situation unfolding before them. They recognized the signs, they saw the mounting losses, and they understood the deeper flaws within their military strategy and command structure. Only one person remained stubbornly blind to these realities: Adolf Hitler himself. Despite mounting evidence and the urgent pleas of his seasoned generals, Hitler refused to accept the gravity of their predicament. It was on the 29th day of June that a significant meeting took place, this time held at Hitler's mountain retreat, known as the Berghof, nestled amidst the majestic Bavarian Alps. This location offered a remote, private setting away from the war's chaos, but it did little to alter the bleak truth that had become evident to everyone present. In preparation for this critical discussion, the two senior German officers, General Rommel and Field Marshal von Rundstedt, departed from France and made their flight across several hours of turbulent skies, finally arriving in Germany. Their journey had taken them far from the front line, leaving behind the crumbling, increasingly desperate battlefronts that exemplified the crumbling confidence and strength of the German military effort. The long and arduous trip over hundreds of miles underscored a stark truth. The top commanders recognized that the Central Command was deeply dysfunctional. These generals had to travel vast distances, more than 1,000 miles, to speak directly with Hitler, who insisted on remaining isolated in his mountain retreat, disconnected from the grim realities faced daily by the soldiers on the front lines. This fact alone revealed much about the fractured state of German military leadership and the inability of the command structure to effectively respond to the unfolding crisis. During this crucial meeting, General Rommel took center stage and laid out the troubling situation in blunt, unmistakable terms. His message was clear and unambiguous, an alarming warning meant to pierce through any denial or wishful thinking. The message conveyed that the German front was no longer capable of holding its positions indefinitely. The soldiers, brave and determined as they might have been, could not defeat the technologically superior adversaries with rifles, an analogy that emphasized the disparity of firepower and resources. They could not counter the relentless aerial assaults with mere machine guns, nor could they halt advancing tanks with outdated tactics. Every day brought losses, territory lost to the enemy that could never be reclaimed. The progress of the Allies was unrelenting and steadily growing stronger, while German forces were visibly weakening under the weight of mounting casualties and numerical disadvantages. The stark reality was that the Germans faced an inevitable outcome. The choice was no longer about whether they would lose the war, but about how swiftly and at what cost that defeat would come. Rommel spoke with a sense of urgency, reflecting the desperation felt by many in the command. He asked whether Germany should continue to squander its remaining strength holding onto insignificant, strategically irrelevant territory, or whether it would be wiser to conserve their forces and resources for a strategic defense that might yet yield some hope of survival or a chance for a counterattack. In the face of this candid assessment, Hitler responded with his characteristic optimism, his familiar arguments, and steadfast delusions. He assured his generals that additional divisions would soon arrive, bolstering their weakened ranks. He propagated the idea that wonder weapons, cutting-edge technology, and armaments would be deployed to devastate Britain, turning the tide of the war in their favor. He confidently claimed that the alliance between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union was inherently unstable and would collapse under its own contradictions. He insisted that the Western allies, burdened with mounting casualties, would eventually lose their will to continue fighting, thus sealing Germany's victory. According to Hitler, only one thing was needed: for Germany to hold on until the inevitable moment when the tide would turn, until the wind of change would sweep in their favor. All they needed was patience, perseverance, and unwavering faith in the victory he promised. But amidst this rhetoric, General von Rundstedt could no longer conceal his growing frustration and skepticism. For months, he had heard similar assurances that turned out to be empty promises or misguided optimism that clashed sharply with observable reality. He had watched his country's military situation deteriorate, his soldiers suffer devastating losses, and the relentless destruction of German cities continue unabated. Tired of engaging in polished, courteous discussions that failed to bring any tangible change, he finally broke through the veneer of diplomatic propriety. With quiet resolve, he declared that the war in the West was no longer merely ongoing. It was in fact lost, not merely at risk, but fundamentally compromised and doomed to failure. The only question that remained was not whether Germany would be defeated, because that was now an inevitability, but precisely when that defeat would occur and at what staggering cost. He pointed out that the relentless continuation of the conflict was leading to unnecessary death and destruction. Each new day saw more German soldiers dying needlessly, sacrificing their lives in a crusade that was slipping further from their grasp. Civilian cities, once bustling centers of life and culture, were increasingly reduced to rubble, victims of relentless aerial bombardments and relentless military campaigns. In his sober assessment, the only rational course of action was to recognize the hopelessness of their situation and attempt to negotiate an end to the fighting before the entire country was destroyed, before there was nothing left to salvage, no remnants of what once was a proud nation. When von Rundstedt's words hung in the air, Hitler's gaze fixed upon him, and a tense silence settled over the room. The other officers, hesitant and uncomfortable, looked away or stared at the floor, unwilling to associate themselves with such candidness that could be viewed as defeatist or disloyal. Suddenly, Hitler's temper erupted. His voice, once calm and commanding, grew loud and filled with fury as he launched into accusations aimed at von Rundstedt. He branded him a coward, a defeatist, a betrayer of the German people and those brave soldiers fighting valiantly on the battlefield. Hitler clung stubbornly to his conviction that victory was still within reach. If only the generals could believe in it as he did and fight with the ferocity and resolve he demanded. He insisted that the war could still be won if only they abandoned their doubts and rallied behind his vision of hope. As the meeting drew to a close, no decisions were made and no consensus was reached. The underlying truth remained unaltered. Nothing had changed, and nothing was likely to change. Von Rundstedt and Rommel, cognizant of the futility of their words, but committed to honesty, prepared to return to France, fully aware that they had voiced inconvenient truths that had been met with rejection and denial. Just 2 days later, on the first day of July, 1944, a telephone call arrived from a man named Kittel. The crisis had deepened dramatically, becoming urgent and undeniable. The immediate catalyst for this communication was the rapid collapse of the defensive positions around Cherbourg and the worsening situation along the Cotentin Peninsula. German military positions were breaching or disintegrating, and the overall defensive line was under severe threat. That very afternoon, the High Command in Germany issued an order that directly contradicted the previous instructions given by von Rundstedt. They decided to allow armored units, tank divisions, and mechanized forces to pull back from their positions near Caen, despite the risk posed by Allied naval and aerial firepower. This strategic withdrawal was a desperate attempt to stabilize the front and stem the tide of the advancing enemy. Kittel, acting on Hitler's behalf, urgently wanted to understand what measures could be taken to halt the relentless collapse and to restore some semblance of order to the disintegrating front line. Von Rundstedt's patience had worn thin with the Schierat. For weeks, he had persistently issued warnings, voicing concerns and cautionary advice, but his words had fallen on deaf ears. Despite his efforts, no action was taken to address the mounting issues he highlighted. Over this period, he had watched helplessly as many brave soldiers, committed to their duty, lost their lives. Sacrifices made in a campaign that, as the weeks dragged on, became increasingly apparent to him as fundamentally doomed. The weight of these failures and the sense of inevitable defeat pressed heavily on him, adding to his frustration and sense of futility. When Kittel, a subordinate or perhaps an officer seeking guidance, finally inquired about what should be done in this dire situation, von Rundstedt didn't hold back. He responded with a candor that was rare among military leaders, especially in such a critical moment. The only honest and straightforward advice he could offer was brutally simple: to end the war. No diplomatic euphemisms, no cautious diplomatic language, no tentative suggestions. Instead, he plainly told them that they needed to cease hostilities, the only course of action left, given how hopeless the situation had become. His words were stark, unembellished, and brutally honest. They cut through the diplomatic pretense, exposing the raw reality of their predicament. The bluntness of his statement reflected not only his frustration, but also the severity of the crisis. Such honesty, however, came at a price. The stark truth was unacceptable to those in power, especially in an environment where maintaining appearances was crucial. As a result of speaking so openly and directly, von Rundstedt's command was immediately undermined, and he was effectively removed from his position. No formal trial or court-martial preceded his dismissal. Instead, his departure was framed as a simple matter of age and health, an official explanation designed to conceal the fact that his outspoken honesty and realistic assessment had led to his downfall. There was no publicly declared disgrace, no dramatic confrontation, no contemptuous firing or humiliating spectacle. Nevertheless, the underlying message was clear. Speaking the raw truth, even when justified, was no longer tolerated in the corridors of power. The regime still sought the support of the old Prussian military aristocracy, whose prestige and traditional authority were deemed essential for maintaining the facade of legitimacy. Officers like von Rundstedt embodied that aristocratic prestige, and thus their influence was still somewhat indispensable. However, his active role in the military hierarchy was effectively over. His candid speech had made his position untenable. The reality he had painfully described was one that the regime was eager to deny or ignore. As history soon proved, every word von Rundstedt had uttered was entirely accurate, reflecting the grim truth of Germany's deteriorating military and strategic situation. In the wake of von Rundstedt's removal, a new figure, von Lüge, arrived with confidence that he could succeed where von Rundstedt had apparently failed. He had demonstrated his military competence through successful command on the Eastern Front, where the brutal realities of warfare tested even the most seasoned officers. Believing that stability could be restored on the Western Front if the situation was managed correctly and with a firm hand, von Lüge approached his new role with determination. However, within days of assuming command, the harsh truth began to crystallize. The reality on the battlefield and in the strategic landscape was as dire, if not more so, than von Rundstedt had described. The situation was catastrophic. The enemies, the Allies, had overwhelming strength and resources, and all efforts to halt their advance seemed futile. It became painfully clear that the Allies would not be held back or stopped, regardless of the efforts made. Less than 3 weeks after von Rundstedt's removal, specifically on the 20th of July in the year 1944, an ambitious and desperate attempt to change the course of events was launched by a group of German military officers. They sought to assassinate Adolf Hitler, whose leadership had become increasingly contested and unpopular among some factions of the military elite. The plot involved Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a courageous officer who devised a plan to end Hitler's life by planting a bomb. During a high-level briefing at the Wolf's Lair military complex, which served as Hitler's command headquarters, von Stauffenberg concealed a bomb inside a small briefcase and positioned it under a conference table where Hitler was present. The attack was meticulously planned, and the bomb detonated precisely at 12:42 in the afternoon. The explosion claimed the lives of 4 individuals and caused injuries to many others present in the room. Despite the devastation, Hitler survived the blast. The heavy wooden conference table acted as a shield, protecting him from the worst of the blast force. He sustained multiple injuries, including ruptured eardrums, severe burns, and splinter wounds, but ultimately, he was alive. The co-conspirators had believed they had successfully struck Auschwitz's pinnacle leader. Their plans also included a series of actions to seize control of the government and military command in the chaos that would follow. They called their operation Operation Valkyrie, a code name that meant to carry out the proposed coup and restore what they saw as the rightful governance of Germany free from Hitler's tyranny. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, chaos reigned. The conspirators assumed Hitler had perished in the blast, which prompted them to implement their carefully prepared plan to seize power. They initiated military operations intended to quickly establish control and assume authority, believing that the chaos and the presumed death of Hitler would give them a decisive advantage. However, their hopes were quickly dashed when news spread that Hitler had survived. The dictator's resilience had stunned all those present, and the news of his survival rapidly undermined the remaining confidence in the coup. The failure of the assassination attempt led to a brutal crackdown. The conspirators, caught off guard by Hitler's unexpected survival, found themselves hunted down and arrested with unprecedented ferocity. Many of them faced torture and swift execution. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who had planted the bomb, was arrested and brought to what became known as the Bendler Block in Berlin. Just after midnight, he was executed by a firing squad, shouting his final words, "Long live sacred Germany," in a fervent protest against the regime he sought to overthrow. Others were hanged using cruel methods, including the infamous practice of suspending individuals from meat hooks with piano wire. Their deaths were often filmed and shown to others as a means of instilling terror and reasserting control. In the days that followed, the Nazi regime launched an extensive purge, targeting anyone associated with the resistance or suspected of disloyalty, no matter how tenuous their connection. The Gestapo relentlessly rounded up thousands of individuals, and in the aftermath of the failed coup, nearly 5,000 people faced execution or imprisonment. The scope of the purge underscored the regime's brutality and determination to eliminate all opposition, regardless of actual guilt, in an effort to consolidate power and reaffirm Hitler's absolute authority. RML found himself embroiled in a deadly conspiracy that was unraveling around him. It was clear that he possessed knowledge of the clandestine plot, yet he chose not to disclose this critical information to the authorities. Evidence, some of it quite compelling, hinted at a more active participation on his part. Yet throughout intense interrogations, he adamantly denied any direct involvement. Despite his denials, the weight of the evidence against him was formidable enough that Adolf Hitler, the supreme leader himself, could no longer afford to ignore it or turn a blind eye. However, RML's extraordinary popularity among the German people complicated matters significantly. His military achievements, particularly his strategic victories in North Africa, had elevated him to the status of a national hero, revered across the country. A public trial exposing him as someone who had betrayed the regime would undoubtedly incite outrage and could threaten the fragile stability of the Nazi leadership. It was a dilemma of immense proportions. On the one hand, justice and internal loyalty demanded accountability. On the other, his charisma and the widespread adulation he enjoyed made a straightforward trial politically unfeasible. Faced with this conundrum, those in charge presented RML with a brutal choice. He could stand before a people's court, where the verdict would most likely be guilty, leading to his execution, and afterward, his family would be subjected to persecution and hardship. Alternatively, he could choose to end his life quietly, taking poison to avoid the shame of a public downfall, thus preserving his reputation and shielding his family from suffering. In this scenario, the authorities would fabricate a story, claiming he had died from his wounds sustained during a strafing attack from Allied aircraft some months earlier. To reinforce the perceived tragedy, they arranged for his funeral to be conducted with full military honors, symbolizing his service and sacrifice to the nation. On the 14th of October, in the year 1944, two high-ranking generals, Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Mazel, arrived at RML's residence in Herlingen carrying the deadly poison. By this time, RML was recuperating from severe injuries sustained when his staff car had been strafed by Allied aircraft in July. Fully aware of his impending fate, he confided in his wife, Lucy, and his son, Manfred, explaining what was about to happen and bidding them a heartfelt farewell. Demonstrating a stoic resolve, he kissed them goodbye, then walked to the waiting car, where he successfully swallowed the cyanide capsule, choosing death over exposure or capture. He was only 52 years old when he met his end. The man who had deeply understood the strategic realities unfolding in Normandy, who had been among the few voices urging Hitler to consider peace negotiations while there was still a chance, had died because his insights proved correct but were ignored. The subsequent state funeral painted a different picture. It celebrated him as a hero who had succumbed to wounds sustained in the line of duty, thereby immortalizing him as a martyr for the Nazi cause. Meanwhile, the downfall of another key figure, Venuga, unfolded with no less tragedy. In early August, the Allied breakout from St. Lo shattered the remaining German defenses on the Western Front. The success of Operation Cobra pierced through German lines and allowed Allied forces to surge into the depths of French territory. In response, von Lage ordered a desperate counterstrike at Mortain, a move demanded by Hitler himself, even though von Lage knew that any such effort was doomed from the outset. This counterattack ended in failure, a crushing blow to the morale and strategic position of the German army. As the American and British troops advanced relentlessly, German forces found themselves nearly encircled at Falaise. This trap would prove catastrophic. Over 50,000 soldiers from the German Wehrmacht were either killed or captured in what became known as the Phillips Pocket. The once formidable German 7th Army was effectively annihilated, ceasing to function as a coherent fighting force. Suspecting Venuga of attempting to negotiate a peace settlement with the Allies, a move that would have contradicted Hitler's unwavering stance, Supreme Führer Adolf Hitler summoned him back to Berlin. On the 19th of August, 1944, as Venuga's car approached the German capital near the town of Metz, he pulled it to the side of the road. In a final act of defiance and despair, he swallowed cyanide, choosing death over surrender or betrayal. He was 61 years old. Before taking his life, he left a poignant letter for Hitler, urging him to summon the strength and greatness necessary to halt what appeared to be an utterly hopeless struggle. Sadly, this plea went unheard. The pattern was painfully clear. Every senior military commander who recognized the dire situation and dared to voice the truth was systematically destroyed. Hitler surrounded himself with yes-men, individuals who echoed his own views, and purged those who dared to challenge him or offer unpleasant truths. The regime's system systematically punished honesty and rewarded delusion, creating a self-destructive cycle that guaranteed its inevitable failure. Throughout this period, the relentless trajectory of the military campaign unfolded precisely as Venuga had forecasted. The conclusive loss of key strategic locations became inevitable. Paris, the monumental capital of France, fell into Allied hands on the 25th of August, 1944, marking a decisive turning point in the war. French forces, bolstered by American support, liberated their city after years of German occupation, signifying the final blow to German dominance in Western Europe. By the month of September, the Allied forces had steadily advanced to the very border of Germany, bringing with them a sense of impending victory that seemed increasingly inevitable. Through relentless effort and strategic precision, they had succeeded in liberating the neighboring countries of the Netherlands and Belgium, along with a significant portion of France's territory. These nations, once under Nazi control, had now regained their independence, swelling the ranks of the Allied coalition and boosting the morale of the Western Front. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the battle that the military strategist von Rundstedt had once believed was destined to be lost, according to his somber assessment in July, had dragged on for another full 8 months, transforming what once seemed like a swift campaign into a brutal, drawn-out conflict. During this period, the intensity of the bombing campaign increased exponentially, with Allied forces unleashing devastating aerial attacks upon German cities, reducing them to piles of smoldering ruins. Cities such as Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin, along with numerous others, were subjected to relentless bombing raids that left their once proud infrastructures flattened and their landscapes transformed into vast fields of debris. The destruction was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, men, women, and children, perished under the relentless onslaught, their lives shattered along with the urban centers that had once been bustling hubs of activity. As the bombs rained down, Europe's industrial backbone buckled under the strain, with production lines coming to a halt and essential war materials becoming scarce. The transportation networks, railways, roads, and ports began to break down, disrupting supplies and isolating German military units from their supply sources and reinforcements. It was a systematic, almost methodical effort to dismantle Germany's war machine from within, while the German leadership stubbornly refused to accept the reality of their military situation, insisting against all evidence that victory remained within reach. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the situation was far graver, even more catastrophic than in the West. The Soviet forces, under the codename Operation Bagration, launched a massive offensive on June 23, 1944. This operation marked a turning point that decimated the German Army Group Center in a defeat even more crushing than the infamous Battle of Stalingrad. The Soviet advance was astonishing in its speed and scale. Within just 2 months, they pushed their lines forward by approximately 400 miles, reaching the outskirts of Warsaw by early August. By January of the following year, they had advanced even further, crossing the Oder River, which lay less than 50 miles from Berlin itself. The human toll of this brutal conflict was staggering. Millions of lives lost, soldiers on both sides, and countless civilians caught in the crossfire. The war persisted solely because one man, firmly refusing to accept defeat, surrounded himself with loyal subordinates who, either out of fear or unwavering devotion, shielded him from the truth. This refusal to acknowledge reality prolonged the suffering on an unimaginable scale. Yet, against all odds, the story of von Rundstedt was not yet at its conclusion. In September of 1944, as Germany faced a dire predicament, being threatened by invasions from both the Eastern and Western fronts, Adolf Hitler made a decisive move. He recalled von Rundstedt from his relatively quiet position to assume command once more. The old field marshal, aged 69, tired, and suffering from heart problems, was brought back in the fold to serve as commander-in-chief of the Western defenses, a role he had previously held but had been compelled to relinquish. Why was he summoned back? Simply put, because there was no one else remaining to step into such a crucial role. The cadre of capable generals had been decimated. Many were dead, others imprisoned, some disgraced by failure, and many too exhausted to continue. Hitler needed a figure who still commanded respect within the officer corps, someone whose name carried enough weight to hold together the crumbling military structure. David von Rundstedt accepted this appointment, fully aware of his own limitations. He was well into his 60s, fatigued from years of service, and battling his own health issues. He did not harbor illusions about what he could accomplish at this stage. He openly confided to his staff that his role was simply to oversee a catastrophe rather than to prevent one. The war was, for all practical purposes, already lost. Everyone involved, except perhaps Hitler, knew that victory was an unattainable dream. Still, Germany continued to fight blindly, and their soldiers kept risking their lives on the battlefield. Someone had to issue commands, even if those commands could no longer alter the outcome of the war. The nation was in a desperate state, hanging on to the faint hope that any last effort could turn the tide. In the cold winter of December 1944, Hitler initiated his final major offensive on the Western Front. This attack through the dense Ardennes forest, which would come to be known historically as the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's plan, an audacious push meant to break through the Allied lines and possibly turn the tide of the war in his favor. However, this operation was not von Rundstedt's idea. In fact, the field marshal had opposed it from the outset. He believed that the German forces, as allocated, were inadequate to achieve the ambitious objectives set before them. He was deeply concerned about the logistical realities, that the supply lines were stretched thin and incapable of sustaining a full-scale offensive over such a vast and difficult terrain. From his perspective, the entire plan was fundamentally flawed, an unnecessary gamble that risked further depleting Germany's last reserves of manpower and material without any realistic hope of success. Von Rundstedt argued that the war effort should instead focus on a more limited, controlled attack, one that might achieve localized success without exposing the entire army to the destructive risks associated with such an extensive offensive. He warned that the available fuel supplies were insufficient to reach the critical port of Antwerp, the operation's declared goal, and that the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, lacked the capacity to provide sustained air support during the operation. Without adequate fuel, aircraft, and logistical backing, the plan was practically doomed from start. Even if the attack managed to break through the Allied lines in the Ardennes, von Rundstedt knew that it could neither be exploited nor maintained, and would inevitably result in heavy German casualties and resource exhaustion. Despite these reservations, Hitler pressed forward with the offensive, dismissing the strategic concerns and focusing instead on the political and symbolic importance of the attack. The field marshal's advice, rooted in military prudence, was ultimately ignored as Hitler insisted on pursuing the full, in-depth attack. Instead, von Rundstedt proposed a scaled-down alternative, a more modest operation that might achieve some limited success without risking the entire German war effort. His plan was rooted in realism, emphasizing caution and strategic restraint in hopes of conserving precious resources and manpower. But this advice was overshadowed by Hitler's unwavering resolve to push ahead with his bold and risky gamble. Adolf Hitler publicly dismissed the proposal, firmly deciding that the planned attack would proceed exactly as he had initially ordered. Despite any opposition or reservations, he made it clear that his will would dominate the military strategy. On the 16th day of December in the year 1944, the final, major German offensive operation got underway, utilizing approximately 30 divisions. These were the last significant reserves that the German Wehrmacht still held in its arsenal. With meticulous planning, the attack achieved a remarkable feat. It caught the Allies entirely off guard, surprising them completely. The American forces stationed in the region were deeply unprepared for such an aggressive assault, mainly because they had become convinced that the German military lacked the capacity to launch a major offensive at this stage of the war. As a result, the front lines rapidly became destabilized. The attack caused a massive bulge in the American defensive line, stretching roughly 50 miles deep into enemy territory, creating a salient that protruded into the Allied territory. Certain units of the American army were overwhelmed and overrun by German advances, while others retreated in a state of panic, abandoning their positions in disarray. For a brief period, it appeared as though Hitler's risky gamble might actually pay off, potentially altering the course of the war in Germany's favor. However, the insightful forecasts of General Ferdinand von Rundstedt proved crucial, because his analyses and predictions concerning the offensive's viability and likely consequences proved to be correct in every major aspect. The Germans' momentum was short-lived, however, as their supply lines began to falter. Their tanks, once formidable weapons, stood motionless along the roads with exhausted fuel tanks, rendering them ineffective. Once the weather cleared, Allied aircraft, now unimpeded, targeted these immobilized vehicles with relentless precision, turning the German halted columns into easy targets. The resistance mounted by American forces at critical strongpoints, most notably at Bastogne, played a pivotal role in delaying the German advance, forcing them to pause and disrupting their carefully planned timetable for the operation. Once the skies cleared following the Christmas holiday, Allied air power returned in force. Its devastating effect reduced the bulk of the German salient, causing it to diminish significantly. By the end of January in the year 1945, the Germans found themselves driven back to nearly their original positions. They had suffered around 100,000 casualties and lost approximately 800 tanks, machines that could never be replaced, never restored to their former strength. The Ardennes offensive, often called the Battle of the Bulge, had achieved nothing concrete except to hasten Germany's defeat by depleting vital resources that might have sustained the German war effort for a few additional weeks. In essence, this offensive marked the last attempt by Germany to mount a significant offensive operation. After its failure, the Nazi military machine was left with nothing but retreating, defensive stance and an inevitable surrender. General Ferdinand von Rundstedt understood this reality clearly. Every officer who possessed even the faintest comprehension of military tactics and the harsh truths of warfare recognized that the tide had turned irreversibly against Germany. Still, the war persisted because one man, Adolf Hitler, refused to accept the inevitable, refusing to let it end. In the early months of 1945, specifically in March, General Ferdinand von Rundstedt was dismissed from his command for the final time. On the 7th day of March, Allied forces succeeded in capturing the strategically vital Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, crossing the Rhine River intact for the first time in the history of warfare since the days of Napoleon Bonaparte. Hitler, in his paranoia and inability to accept defeat, needed someone to blame for the failure to destroy this critical bridge beforehand. Von Rundstedt, who bore no responsibility for the decision to defend or demolish the bridge, had no direct involvement in the planning or execution of the destruction efforts, nor was he accountable for the ultimate failure. Nonetheless, as the senior military commander on the scene, he was scapegoated and relieved of his duties. He was replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kessler, an officer appointed to take over the struggling Wehrmacht's command. After his dismissal, von Rundstedt returned to his family, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, as well as the effects of years of intense service and deep fatigue. At the age of 69, he carried the scars of a lifetime of military duty, having commanded armies through 3 separate wars, witnessing and participating in countless victories and catastrophic defeats. Over the course of his long military career, he had seen enough to understand the true nature of the war, what could be won and what was lost, what was strategically sound and what was doomed to failure. Despite his insights and correct assessments, he paid a heavy personal price, being punished for his honesty and foresight. Germany surrendered unconditionally, bringing an end to the conflict in Europe on the 8th day of May in the year 1945. By that point, Hitler had already died, having committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on the 30th of April, as Soviet forces advanced relentlessly into the city. The so-called Thousand-Year Reich, which Hitler had proclaimed at the start of his reign, lasted only a little over 12 years and 4 months before it was finally dismantled. The war across Europe had resulted in staggeringly high casualties, claiming the lives of around 40 million people, among whom 6 million were Jews systematically murdered in the Holocaust. Germany itself lay in utter ruin, its cities destroyed, its infrastructure reduced to rubble, its population displaced and homeless, and its future uncertain and bleak. The scars of war stayed with the continent long after the guns fell silent, and the shadow of defeat cast a long pall over what was left of a once proud nation. On the first day of May in the year of 1945, during the final chaos of World War II in Europe, a notable figure known as von Rundstedt was unexpectedly captured by American military forces. This capture occurred at a hospital located in the town of Bad Tölz, where he was receiving medical treatment for a severe condition affecting his leg, accompanied by ongoing heart problems that compromised his health. Despite the circumstances of his detention, he was treated with a degree of respect and courtesy that befits his rank and venerable age. The American soldiers, upon realizing who they had taken into custody, found themselves in a complex situation, unsure of how precisely to handle this individual who had been a prominent senior officer within the Nazi hierarchy. Von Rundstedt's situation was indeed complicated, as he was evidently a high-ranking commander who had served Adolf Hitler diligently throughout the years of wartime conflict. Yet, at the same time, he was also a traditional military officer in the classical sense, someone who had apparently harbored disagreements with many of the more heinous Nazi policies. Such dissent, however, did not seem to have led to any significant change in his fate during the war. Notably, he had been dismissed from his position on 2 separate occasions, each time reportedly because he spoke too frankly and honestly about the regime's policies, risking his standing within the party. His complex character, therefore, embodied a mixture of loyalty, disillusionment, and a certain adherence to military principles that sometimes conflicted with the brutal directives of his superiors. Several years after the war's conclusion, in the winter of 1949, the British authorities formally brought charges against von Rundstedt on allegations of war crimes. The primary accusations centered around his alleged involvement in the mistreatment and unlawful execution of prisoners of war, which were purportedly violations of international laws governing armed conflict. Among the most serious accusations was his role in transmitting Hitler's infamous commando order, a ruthless directive that commanded the immediate shooting of all captured Allied commandos, refusing them any status as prisoners of war. This order had unleashed a wave of executions, with von Rundstedt's signature transmission of it to units under his command directly facilitating the death of numerous captured Allied soldiers. The allegations suggested that his actions directly contravened the laws of war and moral standards expected of military officers. However, the subsequent judicial proceedings that would typically be expected to follow such serious charges never came to fruition. Von Rundstedt's declining health became a significant obstacle. His physical condition deteriorated so markedly that he was physically unable to appear before the court, and with his prognosis worsening, the British authorities ultimately decided that pursuing a trial would serve no meaningful purpose. The fact that he was gravely ill and near the end of his life rendered the entire prosecution process logistically and ethically problematic, leading to the conclusion that pursuing justice against a man in such a fragile state would be both futile and perhaps undignified. As a result, the charges against him were ultimately dropped, and he was released from custody in the spring of that same year. Following his release, von Rundstedt retreated from public view and settled into a quiet life near the small town of Celle, situated in the region of Lower Saxony, within the British occupation zone of Germany. There, he lived out his final years largely out of the spotlight, spending his days in relative tranquility alongside his wife. The couple avoided engaging publicly and sought to remain unnoticed by the media and the broader world. Yet, intermittently, military historians with an interest in the complexities of the Second World War managed to seek him out for rare interviews, hoping to obtain his perspective or first-hand insights regarding the conflict. Despite these requests, von Rundstedt often kept his views guarded. He generally refused to discuss the Nazi era openly or to shed light on his personal role during those turbulent times. When questioned about Adolf Hitler, he responded with dismissiveness, as if the very mention of the Führer was beneath further comment, though he did not express any overt remorse. His attitude toward the war itself was more analytical than emotional, and he did not engage in reflective introspection about his actions or decisions. Throughout his final years, von Rundstedt did not produce memoirs or personal writings to justify or explain his choices during the war. He never published any accounts intended to clarify his position, nor did he attempt to justify the extent of his involvement to the public or future generations. Whether this reticence stemmed from declining health, a stoic refusal to dwell on uncomfortable truths, or an unwillingness to confront the implications of his own complicity remains uncertain. His silence has left a space for ongoing debate and speculation among historians, who continue to ponder the motivations and moral responsibilities of figures such as him. On the 24th of February of the year of 1953, at the age of 77, von Rundstedt passed away. His death marked the end of a complex and controversial chapter in history. He was laid to rest with full military honors at Stucken Cemetery in Hanover, a city that had witnessed many upheavals over the years. His gravesite was marked by a modest stone bearing only his name, his rank, and the dates of his birth and death. A stark memorial that gave no indication of his service record, his victories or defeats, or the infamous words he reportedly uttered to Kittel. The simplicity of the monument, devoid of any elaborate inscriptions, echoes the enduring ambiguity surrounding his life. Since then, historians have continually debated what von Rundstedt's life and legacy reveal about the nature of moral responsibility during times of war, and more broadly, within organizations that operate within violent, ethically complex contexts. Some argue that he epitomized the archetype of a senior military officer serving a criminal and morally corrupt regime, suggesting that his aristocratic disdain for Hitler did not prevent him from faithfully executing orders. Others contend that his military expertise, although he may have disapproved of some policies, ultimately facilitated atrocity, whether intentionally or inadvertently, through his influence and actions. The serious war crimes for which he was charged, notably the transmission of orders leading to the deaths of prisoners who should have been protected by international law, remain undeniable facts of history. These acts underscore the ongoing debate about individual accountability and the moral boundaries crossed during times of extreme conflict. Throughout the course of his military career, the commanding officer led numerous campaigns across various regions, including Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. These operations, carried out under his direction, resulted in the loss of countless lives, amounting to millions, as a tragic consequence of widespread warfare. His expertise and professionalism in the art of war were undeniable. However, these qualities were employed on behalf of a criminal regime, an organization responsible for immense human suffering. Some historians and commentators suggest that von Rundstedt was not a fervent ideologue or a true believer in the regime's ideology, but rather a skilled craftsman who served the state diligently, unquestioningly executing orders without necessarily endorsing their underlying moral implications. They interpret his famous remarks to Keeler, remarks that many see as indicative of a man aware of the brutal realities but powerless to intervene effectively, as evidence that he was, at his core, a person caught within the confines of a system he recognized as unjust. According to these interpretations, von Rundstedt felt trapped, bound by a deeply ingrained sense of duty, by traditions emphasizing obedience above all else, and by a lifetime of military training that prioritized unquestioning compliance over moral independence. These factors created a mental framework in which questioning orders was not an option. Instead, the role was to follow instructions, however heinous or misguided they might be. Both perspectives on his character, one viewing him as a dedicated professional and the other as a passive accomplice to evil, contain elements of truth. Human beings are innately complex, often embodying contradictions that defy simplistic classification. History rarely offers straightforward narratives that fully capture the intricacies and nuances of individual lives. What remains evident, however, is that von Rundstedt identified the catastrophic trajectory of the war with remarkable clarity, more so than the majority of his high-ranking German counterparts. As little as 25 days after the D-Day invasion, von Rundstedt grasped the bleak reality that the conflict was beyond salvation, with no reasonable hope of turning the tide. He understood that continuing the fight would only serve to magnify destruction and suffering. His most rational and humane option, in his view, was to seek peace before the remaining resources, lives, and territories were entirely exhausted. And in this belief, he was correct. Every subsequent event only confirmed the soundness of his judgment. The Battle of the Bulge, for example, proved to be a futile attempt to salvage dwindling German reserves, ultimately a desperate and pointless struggle that drained what was left of the country's military strength. Similarly, the defense of the Rhine, the great river that marked the heart of Europe, was nothing more than a delaying action, a vain attempt to buy more time at the expense of increased destruction and loss. The final stand in Berlin, a brutal and bloody confrontation, served no real military purpose whatsoever. Instead, it became an embodiment of chaos and waste. Each day that the war dragged on after the 1st of July, in the year of 1944, was a day marked by needless bloodshed and devastation, inflicted on both German and Allied forces alike. Despite the immense loss and suffering, these extended battles failed to alter the ultimate outcome of the war in even the slightest measure. Von Rundstedt perceived these grim realities with extraordinary clarity and was outspoken about what he saw. He recognized the futility of the continuing conflict and voiced his understanding plainly and directly. The profound lesson embedded in his story lies in the dangers inherent in organizations that punish honesty and suppress the truth. Under Hitler's Germany, the entire system was meticulously designed to facilitate self-deception and denial. Upward communication was carefully filtered. Good news, often exaggerated or overly optimistic, was encouraged to flow up through the ranks, fostering a false sense of security and confidence within the leadership. Conversely, bad news or honest reports revealing inconvenient realities were systematically softened, delayed, or entirely blocked from reaching decision-makers. Officials who dared to report unfavorable developments, those that might cast doubt on the regime's plans, were often branded defeatist and replaced by those willing to tell the leadership what they wanted to hear. Over time, this pattern created a leadership that grew increasingly disconnected from the actual situation on the ground, making decisions based not on tangible facts but on illusion and wishful thinking. This destructive pattern is not unique to Nazi Germany, but repeats itself throughout human history, across various types of organizations. Corporations, for instance, often penalize managers who provide honest assessments of problems, fostering an environment of superficial positivity at the expense of addressing real issues. Governments may promote officials who support existing policies while marginalizing dissenters or critics who question the prevailing narratives. Militaries, the very institutions trained to confront uncertainty and chaos, have frequently silenced officers who challenge established doctrines or question strategic choices. In every one of these cases, the short-term comfort derived from conformity and collective illusion masks a looming disaster, which ultimately materializes when reality inevitably forces itself into the open. The suppression of truthful reporting and genuine discourse, although seemingly advantageous in the moment, sow the seeds of long-term catastrophe. Ultimately, history consistently demonstrates that organizational failure often arises from the inability to confront uncomfortable truths and the tragic consequences that result from prioritizing harmony and obedience over honesty and critical questioning. In the highest echelons of powerful organizations, decision-making is often driven not by an objective or accurate understanding of reality, but rather by information that has been carefully filtered and shaped to align with the psychological comfort of those in control. This tendency creates a distorted perception of the truth, as leaders and decision-makers tend to believe and accept their own propaganda because it is reinforced continually by the people around them. The environment becomes one where dissenting voices are drowned out, and the leader's convictions are solidified by a chorus of confirmation from their inner circle. By the time they finally face the stark reality, when the brutal, undeniable facts pierce through layers of deception, finding the truth becomes impossible to ignore. At that moment, it is often too late to alter the course of events. The damage has already been inflicted, and the opportunity for correction has long since elapsed. This phenomenon was vividly exemplified during critical moments in history, such as the final years of the Second World War. The renowned German officer and military thinker, von Rundstedt, expressed a blunt and urgent appeal in July of 1944, when he famously declared, "End the war, you idiots." This statement was not merely an assessment of Germany's military struggles at that point. It was a candid indictment of a deeply flawed system that had rendered honest appraisal of their situation impossible. His words conveyed the cruel reality that those in leadership had become blind to what anyone with functioning eyesight could see, an indication that they had lost the capacity to recognize defeat, even as all evidence pointed toward impending catastrophe. Von Rundstedt's outcry was rooted in frustration and despair. A professional who had dedicated his entire life honing a highly demanding craft and now watched helplessly as that craft was dismantled by fools who mistakenly believed that sheer willpower could substitute for facts, and that faith alone could triumph over mathematics. His pointed remark exposed a tragic truth. The leaders, ensnared in their own illusions, failed to act when decisive action was needed most. Instead of halting the destructive momentum, they persisted in their futile efforts for 10 more months, prolonging the agony for their nation. Their stubbornness led to the systematic destruction of their homeland, as countless young soldiers were sent into hopeless battles, sacrificing their lives for objectives that were ultimately unattainable and strategies that were doomed from the start. As the war drew to its inevitable conclusion, after months of relentless devastation, the ruins smoldered still, and the dead lay piled in silent acknowledgment of the catastrophe. The survivors, already marked by loss and despair, grappled with the haunting question of how an entire nation, educated and capable, could have been led astray by a madman to the brink of complete annihilation. Part of the answer lies in a sinister pattern that persisted throughout this tragic chapter. The voices of truth, those who dared to perceive clearly and speak honestly, were systematically silenced. They were dismissed from their positions, arrested, imprisoned, or driven to despair and ultimately to suicide. Meanwhile, the individuals who replaced them offered comforting lies designed to mask the catastrophic decline until literally every shred of hope was obliterated, and the enemy had infiltrated the very streets of the capital, culminating in the fiery destruction of the Reich Chancellery and the fall of the regime. Von Rundstedt recognized the impending doom well in advance, only 25 days after the pivotal D-Day invasion. He spoke plainly, warning of the terminal trajectory that was unavoidable if the course remained unchanged. His honesty cost him dearly. He was swiftly removed from his position because his courage to tell the truth was unacceptable to those in power. The nation continued its descent into chaos and ruin for another 10 months, burning along with its capital, because no one within the leadership was willing to confront the uncomfortable facts he had laid bare. Their refusal to face reality sowed the seeds of destruction, and their inability to listen to truth led to a devastating downfall that could have been mitigated had they acted differently. If you found this story as compelling and thought-provoking as we did, take a moment to reflect on its enduring lessons. It reminds us how crucial honest and courageous communication is, especially in times of crisis, and how dangerous it can be when those with the power to act choose silence or denial instead. Stories like this serve as powerful reminders of past mistakes and the importance of preserving truthful voices in the face of adversity. We invite you to contemplate these lessons and consider their relevance today. Each story from history holds significance. Each is a vital fragment of the collective memory that shapes our understanding of the past and guides our future. We sincerely hope that these tales continue to resonate, and we value your insights and engagement. Please share where you are watching from, as our community spans across many continents and generations, from war veterans and history buffs to students and scholars. All of you are part of something meaningful, an ongoing effort to remember, learn from, and honor the stories that define us. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and thank you for helping to keep these important stories alive for future generations.